Imagine waking up every morning inside a building where the fate of an entire country was decided over breakfast, where the smell of freshly baked bread mixed with the tension of political crisis, where children played in hallways that had witnessed some of the most consequential conversations in American history. This was the White House in 1850. Not a museum, not a monument, but a living, breathing home where real people ate, slept, argued, loved, and governed a nation that was tearing itself apart at the seams. Most people picture the White House as cold marble and formal ceremony. But the reality of 1850 was something far more raw, far more human, and far more astonishing than any textbook has ever told you. In 1850, President Millard Fillmore had just inherited the presidency under the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. President Zachary Taylor, war hero, military legend, had died on July 9, 1850, just 16 months into his term. Some historians believe it was contaminated food at a 4th of July celebration. Others suspected something darker. The nation was in shock, and now a quiet, unassuming man from New York was suddenly living in the most powerful house in America. But here's what nobody talks about. What was daily life actually like inside those walls? According to historical records from the National Archives and the Library of Congress, the White House in 1850 housed not just the president and his family, but a complex web of servants, enslaved workers who had not yet been freed, political advisors who slept in back rooms, and an endless parade of ordinary citizens who could simply walk through the front door. That's right. In 1850, the White House was largely open to the public. Any American could approach the front entrance and request a meeting with the president himself. The staff accounts from that era, preserved at the Library of Congress, describe a building that was simultaneously magnificent and deeply flawed. The East Room, the grandest room in the building, had been used by Abigail Adams to hang laundry when John Adams first moved in decades earlier. By 1850, it served as a public reception hall where hundreds of strangers gathered to shake the president's hand in rituals called public levees. Imagine standing in line for hours, pressed shoulder to shoulder with farmers, merchants, politicians, and diplomats, all waiting to touch the hand of the most powerful man in America. Stop and think about that for a second. In 1850, you could walk into the White House, wait in line, and shake the president's hand. No security clearance, no metal detectors, no appointment necessary. The democracy was raw and direct in ways that would shock anyone living today. The kitchen, located in the basement according to detailed architectural surveys of the era, operated from before sunrise until late at night. Historical cook records from the Fillmore administration describe meals of extraordinary complexity: roasted meats, elaborate pastries, fresh produce brought daily from nearby markets in Georgetown. But while the dining room upstairs gleamed with silver candelabras and fine china, the people preparing those meals lived in conditions of stark contrast. If you're watching this and feeling something, that pull of curiosity mixed with a kind of disbelief, you are exactly who this documentary was made for. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We've had viewers from all 50 states tune in to discover truths about American history that were never taught in school. Because here is a fact that deserves to be spoken plainly. Historians, including Jesse Carney Smith in Black Firsts and William Seal in his authoritative work, The President's House, have documented that enslaved African Americans performed much of the labor inside and around the White House well into the antebellum period. In 1850, the Compromise of 1850, one of the most consequential pieces of legislation in American history, was being debated in Congress, while the very house where it would be signed was maintained in part by people who had no freedom of their own. The contrast was devastating. And it was real. The White House in 1850 had 31 rooms, according to architectural records of the period. It had no running hot water in most areas. Gas lighting had only recently been introduced. The basement was perpetually damp. Rats were a documented problem. There are actual accounts from staff of that era describing the ongoing battle against rodents in the lower floors. This wasn't a palace. It was a complicated, contradictory, deeply human place. And in the chapters ahead, you're going to discover truths about life inside those walls that will change the way you see American history forever. Don't go anywhere, because what happened in the private quarters of the White House in 1850 is something historians rarely talk about, and it is extraordinary. Behind closed doors, the private world of the first family. The private quarters of the White House in 1850 were located on the second floor, and according to historian William Seal's definitive research in The President's House, A History, they were far smaller and more modest than most Americans imagined. President Millard Fillmore, his wife Abigail, and their two children, Millard Powers Fillmore and Mary Abigail Fillmore, occupied a series of interconnected rooms that served simultaneously as living quarters, offices, and meeting spaces. Abigail Fillmore is one of the most underappreciated figures in White House history, and what she did inside those walls in 1850 was nothing short of remarkable. When the Fillmore family arrived at the White House in the summer of 1850, Abigail was horrified to discover, and this is documented in letters she personally wrote, preserved at the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society, that the entire executive mansion had no library, not a single bookshelf, not one organized collection of books for the use of the president or his family. For Abigail Fillmore, a former school teacher who had educated herself in a frontier cabin in New York, this was almost incomprehensible. She immediately petitioned Congress for funds to establish a proper library. Congress approved the request, and in 1850 the first permanent White House library was created, stocked with books that Abigail herself selected. Historical accounts confirm she chose volumes of history, science, poetry, and fiction. This woman, who had grown up in poverty and taught herself to read using whatever books she could find, now curated the intellectual resources of the American presidency. Can you imagine the weight of that moment? But the private life of the White House in 1850 extended far beyond books. The correspondence of the period, available through the Library of Congress Digital Archive, reveals a household under extraordinary stress. President Fillmore was navigating the most explosive political crisis since the founding of the nation, the question of slavery and whether it would expand into the new Western territories acquired after the Mexican-American War. The Compromise of 1850, championed by Senator Henry Clay and broker Daniel Webster, divided the country bitterly. California would enter as a free state, but the Fugitive Slave Act, one of the most morally repugnant laws ever passed in American history, would require citizens in the North to actively assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. Fillmore signed it, and historians debate that decision to this day. Inside the White House, according to accounts from visitors and staff of the period documented by biographer Paul Finkelman, the tension was palpable. Visitors described a president who appeared physically aged by the weight of his decisions. Abigail Fillmore, already suffering from chronic health problems, spent increasing amounts of time in the private library she had created, reading, writing, finding refuge in the world of ideas. If you're still here watching, and we know you are because you care about real history, subscribe right now. Hit that button, because in the next chapter, we're going into the parts of this building that have been hidden from public knowledge for over 170 years. The children's experience inside the White House was documented in letters and diary entries of the era. Young Mary Abigail Fillmore, who was just 20 years old in 1850, was described by contemporary accounts in Washington newspapers as possessing extraordinary musical ability. She played the harp and piano in the family parlor on the second floor, and those performances, according to social accounts preserved in the Smithsonian Archives, drew visitors and diplomats who would gather informally to listen. The White House piano of that era was a Chickering grand piano, a prestigious American-made instrument. Music in a house filled with political catastrophe was one of the few things that crossed the dividing lines. The domestic staff of the White House in 1850 is a subject that requires honest examination. According to research published by historian Clarence Lusane in The Black History of the White House, enslaved and freed black workers formed a critical part of the workforce that maintained the executive mansion throughout the antebellum period. Their names appear in scattered pay records and account books. Their stories were rarely told, but they were there, cooking, cleaning, maintaining, making possible the rituals of American power, often without the freedom to walk away. This is not comfortable history, but it is true history, and true history is the only kind worth telling. The private rooms of 1850 also tell us about illness and fragility. Heating the White House was an ongoing challenge, wood-burning fireplaces in major rooms, but vast, drafty corridors and poorly insulated walls. Multiple accounts from the period describe White House residents suffering from persistent respiratory ailments during Washington winters. The city of Washington itself in 1850 was not the gleaming capital we picture today. The Washington Monument was only partially built. Construction had halted due to funding disputes. The National Mall was swampy, unplanned terrain. Livestock could be found wandering what is now the ceremonial heart of American democracy. The capital city and the house at its center were both works in progress, imperfect, struggling, magnificent in potential. The city outside the gates, Washington in 1850. Step outside the White House gates in 1850, and you entered a city unlike anything Americans of later generations would recognize. Washington, D.C. in 1850 had a population of approximately 51,000 people, a modest city by the standards of the time, dwarfed by New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. But it pulsed with a particular intensity that no other American city could match, because it was the place where the most important decisions in the Republic were being made. The streets immediately surrounding the White House were a mixture of grand ambition and practical chaos. Pennsylvania Avenue, the ceremonial road connecting the White House to the Capitol, was often described by foreign visitors as a study in contradictions. Senator Alexis de Tocqueville's earlier observations about American democracy were being played out in physical form. Wide avenues laid out with imperial confidence, but unpaved sections that turned to mud in rain, open drainage ditches, and half-finished buildings standing next to empty lots. Contemporary accounts from the Washington newspapers of 1850, accessible through the Library of Congress, chronicling America Digital Archive, describe the avenue as lined with hotels, taverns, boarding houses, and shops that catered to the constant flow of politicians, lobbyists, journalists, and citizens who poured into the city during congressional sessions. Here's something that will stop you cold. In 1850, there was an active slave market in Washington, D.C., just blocks from the White House. The Franklin and Armfield slave trading operation had operated in the city for decades. Enslaved human beings were bought and sold within sight of the building where American freedom was proclaimed as the highest value of civilization. This was documented extensively by contemporary journalists and abolitionists, including accounts preserved in the papers of Frederick Douglass at the Library of Congress. The Compromise of 1850 would eventually abolish the slave trade, not slavery, but the trade in the District of Columbia. But for most of 1850, as Fillmore took office and legislators debated in the Capitol, the trade continued. This is not a footnote in history. This is the central moral reality of the era. Are you beginning to feel the weight of what life in Washington in 1850 actually meant? Because this is what real history feels like, not the sanitized version, but the complicated, painful, extraordinary truth. The social world around the White House in 1850 operated through a rigid hierarchy of dinners, receptions, and formal calls. According to Mary Clemmer Ames's historical accounts and social documentation preserved from the period, Washington society had its own rules, its own power structures, its own celebrities. Senators like Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, the latter dying in March of 1850, were figures of legendary status. Congressional debates were public entertainment. Citizens crowded the galleries of the Senate to watch men like Webster deliver speeches that lasted for hours and were reprinted in newspapers across the country. Markets near the White House, particularly the Center Market on Pennsylvania Avenue, were described in period accounts as extraordinary sensory experiences. Vendors from Maryland and Virginia brought produce, livestock, and goods by horse and wagon before dawn. The market opened in darkness, and by sunrise was a cacophony of commerce. Voices haggling in English and German and French, the smell of fresh fish from the Potomac, the sound of livestock, the visual spectacle of a city feeding itself. The Potomac River in 1850 was both a vital artery of commerce and a source of profound public health concern. Sewage and waste drained directly into channels connected to the river. Malaria was endemic in the low-lying areas near the water. The swampy terrain that Washington was built upon, famously mocked by European diplomats who called assignment to the American capital a form of punishment, created persistent health problems that affected everyone from the poorest laborer to the president himself. Subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment. Where are you watching from, and what about this era surprises you most? Your comments tell us what history you want us to uncover next. The transportation connecting Washington to the rest of the country in 1850 was in rapid transformation. The railroad had arrived. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad connected Washington to the growing network of tracks spreading across the nation. But travel was still slow, still uncertain, still occasionally dangerous. A letter from Washington to Boston took days. News traveled at the speed of horses and trains, not electricity. The telegraph was only beginning to transform communication, and even that miracle technology was available to only a few. The foreign diplomatic community in Washington in 1850 occupied a peculiar position. Ambassadors and ministers from European powers, Latin American nations, and others sent to the American capital wrote home with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. They admired the democratic experiment. They were baffled by the contradictions, the most prominent being that a nation built on the rhetoric of human liberty simultaneously practiced chattel slavery at an industrial scale. British diplomat Henry Unwin Addington, in correspondence preserved in British Foreign Office archives, described Washington as a city of magnificent intentions, imperfect execution, and moral paradox that defies simple explanation. He was not wrong. The edge of the storm. What 1850 meant for America's future. By the end of 1850, something had shifted in America that could not be shifted back. The Compromise of 1850 had passed. California had entered the Union as a free state. The slave trade had been abolished in the District of Columbia, but the Fugitive Slave Act had been signed into law, and it transformed the moral landscape of the entire nation in ways that would accelerate the march toward catastrophic civil war. President Fillmore believed he had saved the Union. Historians have debated that judgment for 170 years. What we know, from the documented historical record, from letters and newspapers and congressional records and personal diaries of the era, is that the year 1850 was a hinge point in American history, a moment when one set of decisions might have prevented what came next, or merely delayed it. The Civil War, which would erupt 11 years later, was already visible in the tensions of 1850 if you knew where to look, and the White House was the center of it all. The daily schedule of President Fillmore in 1850, reconstructed from accounts in the Buffalo Historical Society collections and period Washington newspapers, reveals a man under siege by the demands of office. Public hours began early in the morning, when citizens arrived at the White House seeking appointments, favors, jobs, and justice. The spoils system, the practice of rewarding political allies with government positions, meant that the president was personally involved in thousands of patronage decisions. Men came from across the country seeking postmaster positions, custom house appointments, and federal jobs of every description. Imagine opening your front door every morning to find hundreds of strangers waiting to ask you for something. That was the presidency of 1850. No executive staff in the modern sense. no press secretary, no chief of staff. Just a man, his family, a small circle of advisors, and the crushing weight of a nation's needs. The issue of slavery was inescapable inside the White House walls. We know from historical scholarship, particularly the work of Adam Goodhart documented in 1861, the Civil War awakening, and from primary sources at the Library of Congress, that the political debates of 1850 were not abstract. They were immediate, personal, explosive. Senators who had been colleagues for decades stopped speaking to each other. Friendships of 30 years collapsed over the question of whether human beings could be owned. Fillmore's signing of the Fugitive Slave Act cost him enormously. The anti-slavery faction of the Whig Party never forgave him. His own party refused to renominate him for the 1852 election. He left the White House in 1853, quietly, without ceremony, a man who had tried to hold the center at a moment when the center could not hold. But here is the truth that matters most. The people who actually lived inside the White House in 1850, the family, the staff, the enslaved workers, the visitors, the cooks, the diplomats, were not symbols. They were human beings navigating an extraordinary historical moment with imperfect information, competing loyalties, and the full range of human emotion. Abigail Fillmore died just 1 month after leaving the White House, on March 30, 1853. She stood in the bitter cold of the outdoor inaugural ceremony for Franklin Pierce and contracted pneumonia. She never recovered. The woman who had created the White House Library, who had brought music and books and intellectual life into those rooms, was gone within weeks of leaving them. Her daughter Mary Abigail, that gifted young musician who had played harp in the family parlor, died the following year, in 1854, at just 22 years old. The Fillmore family's time in the White House ended in grief piled upon grief. These are real people, real losses, real history. The Washington of 1850 that we have explored together in this documentary was a city and a nation at the edge of its most terrible trial. The White House that Fillmore inherited was a home trying to contain contradictions that could not be contained. The democracy that Americans celebrated was simultaneously a promise and a profound failure, magnificent in aspiration, devastatingly incomplete in practice. The Civil War would come. The White House would survive it. Abraham Lincoln would stand in those same rooms 11 years later, confronting the consequences of every compromise that came before him. But in 1850, in those 31 rooms on Pennsylvania Avenue, people were living their lives, complicated, flawed, sometimes heroic, often painful lives, inside the most famous address in America. That is the history that deserves to be remembered. Not the clean version, not the monument version, the true version, in all its complexity and contradiction and humanity. If this documentary moved you, if it showed you something you didn't know, made you feel something you didn't expect, subscribe to this channel right now. Leave us a comment telling us where you're watching from and what part of this history surprised you most. We read every single comment, and we'll see you in the next one, because American history is far stranger, far darker, and far more extraordinary than anyone ever taught us in school.